Okay, let's unpack this. If you're maybe an elementary education major or honestly just someone who's endlessly curious about how young minds really learn, you probably heard the buzz, right? Whispers about the magic of game-based learning. It seems like it's everywhere.
It definitely is a hot topic.
But what exactly makes games so powerful, for helping kids grasp new concepts, build skills, maybe even understand the world a bit better? It often seems to get boiled down to just one word, engagement.
Right, engagement.
So today on the deep dive, we're not just going to say that word. We want to pull back the curtain, really dig into what it means, especially for you.
Yeah, let's get beyond the buzzword.
Our deep dive today is all about exploring those intricate layers of engagement, specifically in game-based learning. We're drawing our insights from some really fascinating excerpts from the Handbook of Game-Based Learning. It's kind of a foundational text in this field.
It really is, a cornerstone.
And our mission? Well, it's to define engagement in a way that actually matters for learning. We want to understand its different forms, explore why it's so critical for, building knowledge, and maybe most importantly, provide practical, actionable insights for future educators like you.
That's the goal, making it useful.
Exactly. This isn't just dry theory. Think of it as a shortcut to being really well-informed. We'll hopefully find some surprising facts, maybe a little bit of humor to keep things moving.
Well, what's truly fascinating here, I think, is how often we do use that word engagement without really grappling with its depth, especially when it comes to games. We might see a child, glued to a screen, totally absorbed, and we think, perfect, they're engaged. But the reality, as our source material really highlights, it's far more nuanced than that.
Okay.
So today, we're going to try and break down this pretty complex concept into clear, actionable insights, things that can genuinely inform your approach when you're thinking about teaching with games. This deep dive, it's really crafted to give you the tools to look at educational games, not just as, fun distractions, but as powerful, intentional learning instruments.
So being able to see under the hood, basically.
Precisely. You'll hopefully be able to identify exactly what kind of engagement a game fosters, and maybe crucially, why that specific kind of engagement actually matters for learning.
That makes sense. It really is true. When we think about engagement in games, these vivid examples probably just pop into mind, right?
Absolutely.
Maybe it's that laser-like focus you see when a child is carefully aiming an angry bird at one of those pig castles, meticulously judging the trajectory and the angle.
Right, the concentration.
Or maybe it's quieter. That intense concentration of a group of students maybe strategizing together in a virtual town, like in some online game, discussing tactics, resource management, defense.
Yeah, the collaborative planning.
And then there's the whole emotional side. I mean, I remember playing a narrative game once where I actually genuinely teared up over a lost companion character.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Which is just a testament to how deeply invested you can become in a story and its characters. It pulls you right in.
That emotional hook is powerful.
Now, if you just think about those examples for a second, you notice this incredible diversity of activities happening, right?
Definitely.
One moment, a child is just watching and processing information on the screen. The next, they're actively planning and taking aim. Then they might be discussing, strategizing with friends, or, like my example, developing this really profound emotional connection.
It's a whole range of actions and reactions.
Yeah, these are all forms of deep involvement, of active participation. So, okay, given all this variety, how do we arrive at a consistent, precise definition, something we can actually use in an educational context? Is it just about fun, or is there something deeper we should be looking for?
That is precisely the challenge our source material grapples with, and it's a fantastic question, because in the academic literature, there's actually a really complex landscape, lots of overlapping definitions. The term engagement itself, it's been examined extensively, not just in games, but also, in traditional classrooms, even in workplace settings.
Right, it's used everywhere.
Exactly. And while there's pretty broad agreement that engagement is generally positive, often essential for learning, there's a really crucial caveat here, especially for you as an educator.
What's that?
It is not simply engagement in a general sense, but rather specific engaged activities that truly support learning.
Okay, so the type of activity matters.
Immensely. This distinction is vital because it tells you what kind of engagement to actually look for and try to foster in your students.
Got it.
You'll often find engagement used almost interchangeably with terms like interest, maybe interactivity, or motivation.
Yeah, I do that.
We all do. But our source highlights that sometimes these are actually separate factors. They might influence engagement or they might be affected by it, but they aren't engagement itself. The text also points out various elements cited as influencing engagement. Things like individual behaviors, attention span, self-regulation, which is that ability to manage your own learning process.
Executive functions.
Right, or self-efficacy, which is basically a child's belief in their own ability to succeed at a task. These internal factors matter.
Sure. Confidence.
And then beyond the learner, game features themselves play a huge role. Things like adaptivity. Does the game adjust to the learner's skill level?
And getting harder or easier.
Exactly. Also, the kind of feedback the game provides, the level of challenge, not too hard, not too easy, or even opportunities for social interaction within the game. All these design choices impact engagement.
Okay, so internal factors and external game design.
Precisely. And researchers have even explored engagement on what they sometimes call conceptual scales, relating it to ideas like immersion or flow.
Flow, I've heard of that. Like being in the zone.
Exactly that feeling. When you're so absorbed in an activity that time just seems to vanish, that intense absorption where everything else just fades away, that's immersion or flow. And it's a really powerful state that games can often induce.
Yeah, definitely experience that.
And, of course, to add another layer, engagement has been broken down into different types. You'll see terms like affective, behavioral, cognitive, emotional, motivational, or psychological engagement.
Wow, that's a lot of types.
It is. And the definitions for these can also vary quite a bit across different studies, which honestly can make it a pretty confusing landscape to navigate.
I can see that. So where does that leave us?
Well, given all this complexity, our source proposes a really clear and, I think, actionable definition, which is key for you as an educator trying to make sense of this.
Okay, let's hear it.
It defines engagement simply as the active and focused investment of effort in a game environment.
Active. Focused investment of effort in a game environment.
Okay, let's dig into that a bit. Active is crucial. It emphasizes the learner's actions, not just something the game is doing to them. It's about their participation.
Right, not passive.
Focused distinguishes it from just, casually fiddling around or multitasking. It implies there's a goal, a purpose, some direction to the activity.
Makes sense.
Investment of effort. That draws on some pretty profound ideas from John Dewey, actually, way back in 1913. It suggests the child is expending energy, maybe mental energy, maybe physical energy, but some kind of deliberate exertion.
Okay, putting something in.
Exactly. And game environment is simply the context, any learning material, really, that has playful elements woven into it. Doesn't have to be a complex video game.
Got it. So this definition really puts the learner and what they're doing right at the center.
Precisely. The spotlight is on the learner's activity.
I think that emphasis on active is what really sets this definition apart, and it might just shift how you, listening right now, see every game and maybe every classroom activity.
It's a key differentiator.
If we contrast it with other ways engagement has been defined, its uniqueness kind of pops. Like, take Chernoff's definition of student engagement in the school. Heightened simultaneous experience of concentration, interest, and enjoyment.
Right. Sounds pretty good on the surface.
It does. It sounds lovely and positive. But the source rightly points out a potential flaw. It assumes enjoyment is always present. But think about it. Have you ever been just grimly determined to beat a really tough level in a game? One that's beaten you like dozens of times.
So absolutely. The frustration is real.
Right. You're still incredibly engaged, pouring effort into it, but enjoyment, that might be long gone, replaced by sheer willpower. I remember spending an entire Saturday once trying to beat this one boss. My partner kept asking if I was having fun.
And you probably weren't saying yes.
Not exactly. I think I grumbled something like, I'm learning resilience. Enjoyment was definitely off the table, but I was highly engaged.
That's a perfect example. Engagement doesn't always equal fun.
And while Chernoff's definition implies activity through task at hand, it doesn't explicitly state the learner's action as central, which this new definition really does.
That's a key difference, the focus on action.
Then there's another definition from O'Brien and Toms, looking at user engagement with technology. They describe it with a long list of characteristics: challenge, aesthetic and sensory appeal, feedback, novelty, interactivity, perceived control and time, awareness, motivation, interest, and effect.
Whoa, that's a mouthful.
Right. And these are all definitely factors that can enhance engagement, no doubt. But again, this definition kind of omits the central importance of activity.
It lists contributing factors, not the core action itself.
Exactly. Plus, not all these factors are essential for engagement. Think about a classic text-based game like Zork from the early 80s.
Oh yeah, text adventures.
Right. There's zero aesthetic or sensory appeal in the modern sense. It's literally just text on a screen.
Yeah.
Yet it was, and still is for many, incredibly engaging. Why? Because it relies entirely on your imagination and your mental effort to bring that world to life.
Your mind is all the graphic rendering.
Totally. It just goes to show that engagement doesn't require flashy graphics or sounds to be powerful. The activity is mental.
A very important point.
And finally, there's Bouvier, Lavue, and Sahaba. They define engagement as the willingness to have emotions, affect, and thoughts directed toward and aroused by the mediated activity in order to achieve a specific objective.
Okay, so focusing on willingness.
Yeah, this one acknowledges the emotional and cognitive bits, which is great, but its focus is on willingness rather than the user's activity. And there's a subtle but, I think, critical difference there. Well, being willing to do something isn't quite the same as actually doing it, right? As the source notes, the will to do something is distinct from actual involvement in an activity. And for elementary school, we know getting kids to actually do something is often the absolute first hurdle to getting them to learn.
That's a sharp observation. Willingness is potential, activity is execution. While these other definitions certainly highlight important elements, individual differences, user responses, specific game features, our proposed definition, focusing on active focus effort, really streamlines this complex idea and makes it highly practical.
Yeah, it feels more grounded.
It truly shifts the spotlight onto what the learner is actively doing. And this becomes particularly useful when we move to a really common point of confusion, the relationship between engagement and interactivity.
Ah, yes. They sound so similar, don't they?
They really do.
It feels so natural to just lump engagement and interactivity together when we talk about games. I mean, games are interactive pretty much by definition, so you might think they're just two sides of the same coin.
It's an easy assumption to make.
But are they really distinct concepts? Or are we just splitting hairs here? I imagine for you, the elementary educator listening, knowing the difference could really help choose the right tools, maybe.
That's a fantastic question. And actually, yes, it's a crucial distinction. Teasing these apart will significantly sharpen your eye for truly effective learning games.
Okay, lay it on us. Interactivity versus engagement.
So interactivity at its core is usually defined as a reciprocal relationship between two entities. Think of it like a back and forth conversation. Your action depends on the system's reaction, and the system's next state depends on your action.
Okay, like cause and effect between me and the game. Click a button, something happens.
Exactly. If you click a button in a learning app and the app responds by showing you something new, that's interactivity. Simple as that.
Right.
But here's where the distinction becomes really clear. You can absolutely have interactivity without engagement.
How does that work?
Well, imagine a player in a game like, say, Clash of Clans. They know they've already lost the battle. It's over. But they might still be kind of idly tapping the screen, placing troops here or there, casting spells maybe, just because the game allows them to.
Okay, yeah. Just clicking around.
Exactly. It's interactive. Their taps are causing reactions in the game world, but there's no clear goal anymore. There's no real focus, no investment of effort towards winning or learning. They're just, as our source puts it, poking around.
Right, I've done that. Just messing about.
That's interactivity, but it's not engagement in the meaningful sense we're looking for when we talk about learning.
Okay, so interactivity without engagement. Got it. What about the other way around?
Conversely, you can also have engagement without interactivity. Picture a game that's heavily narrative-driven, maybe like Uncharted Territory or something similar.
Yeah, lots of story.
So after you complete a really challenging level, the game might switch to a long, beautifully animated cutscene that unfolds the next part of the story.
Cinematic moments.
Now, a player could be intently focused on that cutscene, absolutely gripped by the narrative, processing every detail, developing that emotional connection to the characters we talked about earlier. They are deeply engaged, investing significant mental effort in understanding the story.
Right, totally absorbed.
But in that moment, their physical actions, maybe holding the controller, aren't influencing how the cutscene plays out. There's no reciprocal relationship happening. They're input doesn't change the output.
Ah, I see. You're just watching, but you're really into it.
Exactly. So in that moment, they're highly engaged, but technically not interactive.
Okay, that distinction is actually really helpful.
It is. When we talk about engagement in games for learning, while we obviously consider the responses of the game environment, the feedback, the changes, the spotlight is firmly on the learner. We want to understand what the learner is doing, thinking, feeling, because that's where the actual meaning-making, the learning happens.
It's about their internal process triggered by the game.
Precisely. Understanding this distinction helps us grasp why engagement, specifically that active, focused effort, is so vital for real learning. It's not enough for a game to just be interactive. It has to elicit that focused investment of effort from the child.
Okay, so that brings us to the big why. Why is this kind of engagement the heart of learning? We intuitively know it's good, but what's the actual mechanism?
Right. What's going on under the hood?
I always kind of figured it was just about putting in the hours,
Mm-hmm.
The classic time on task argument, the more time you spend engaged, the more you learn.
That's a common viewpoint, certainly.
Or maybe it was just about making learning feel less like, well, work, distracting kids from the effort involved, making it more palatable.
Those ideas are out there, too, that engagement increases time on task, or distracts from effort, or boosts intrinsic motivation, and those things might happen. But the core theoretical proposition, the real engine, seems to be something deeper, a concept of active learning and closely related generative learning.
Active learning. Okay, tell me more.
This idea isn't new at all. It has really deep roots in educational theory. Think about pioneers like Friedrich Froebel. He developed the whole idea of the modern kindergarten back in the late 19th century.
Right, Froebel's Gifts and Occupations.
Exactly. He strongly promoted what he saw as critical links between doing, experiencing, and thinking. And for you, the elementary education major listening, this is directly applicable to your daily practice. It's the whole reason hands-on play, using manipulatives, letting kids explore why it's so fundamental in early childhood education.
It's not just keeping them busy.
Not at all. It's how young children genuinely construct knowledge. It's learning by doing, literally.
Okay, who else?
Well, similarly, John Dewey and Maria Montessori both heavily emphasize that vital connection between activity and the construction of knowledge. Learning isn't passive reception, it's an active process.
Right, the prepared environment, child-led activity.
Precisely. And much later, M.C. Whitrock, writing during the shift from behaviorism towards cognitivism in education, focused broadly on this idea that learning isn't just about what's presented to the learner. It depends heavily on the active and constructive role of the learner.
So what the learner brings to it or does with it.
Exactly. He called this generative learning. He stressed that comprehension depends directly on what students generate during instruction. They aren't just passive sponges absorbing information. They are active builders of understanding, connecting new stuff to what they already know.
Generating meaning. Okay.
And more recently, Richard Mayer, whose work on multimedia learning is really influential, described the learner's role very much in terms of activity. He argues that for meaningful learning to happen, the learner must actively process incoming information by selecting what's relevant, organizing those selected pieces mentally, and then relating them, integrating them with their prior knowledge. The learner, in his view, is an active sense maker, constantly trying to build a coherent mental picture. It's all about what the learner is doing with the information internally.
So across history, the consensus is activity is key.
It really seems to be a central thread.
Yeah.
And there are a number of empirical studies that strongly support this idea that specific learner activities profoundly affect learning outcomes.
Like actual research showing this.
Yes. For instance, Glenn Berg and his colleagues back in 2004 did these experiments with young children. Some kids read a text while manipulating small toys that corresponded to the story, like moving toy animals as they read about them.
Okay.
Others just read and reread the text. And even a group that just imagined manipulating the toys showed significantly higher recall and comprehension scores compared to the rereading group.
Wow, even imagining it helped.
It did. And for you, the elementary educator, this is huge validation for things you probably already do or want to do. Imagine your first grade class. They're not just hearing a story about farm animals. They're physically moving their little toy pigs and cows as the narrative unfolds.
Making the story come alive.
Exactly. They might be giggling, sure, but more importantly, they are constructing meaning with their hands, embedding those words and concepts far deeper than passive listening ever could. It's that multisensory learning in action.
That makes so much sense. What else?
Another fascinating line of research investigated something called the enactment effect. This gives us surprising insight into how deeply connected physical activity is to memory and learning.
Enactment effect.
Okay. Studies by researchers like Engelkamp and Den found that when people listen to simple action phrases like raise your arm, those who were instructed to physically act out the phrase while listening recalled it better later than those who just listened.
Just doing the action helps you remember the words.
It seems so, and what's even more compelling is that this effect was stronger when the actions were self-initiated by the person, rather than just them imitating someone else's action.
Ah, so having agency in the action matters.
It appears to. So for your classroom, this is a clear signal to incorporate kinesthetic learning whenever you can. When you're teaching verbs, don't just list them on the board. Have the students physically act them out. Jump, spin, crouch.
Get them moving.
Yes. Or, when learning about something like the water cycle, have them physically demonstrate evaporation rising up, condensation bunching together, precipitation falling down. Give them agency in how they move and embody the learning. It really helps cement the knowledge.
I love that. Concrete actions for abstract concepts.
And further supporting this, Schwartz and Plass in 2014 looked at this enactment effect in a game-like virtual environment. Participants interacted with action phrases shown with graphics.
On a screen.
Yes. They found that for phrases where participants had to perform a click and drag action, actively manipulating something on screen, those phrases were recalled better later than items where they just listened, just looked, or just did a simple click.
So dragging is better than clicking.
In this context, for recall, yes. It suggests that active manipulation, even virtual manipulation, leads to deeper memory and coding than more passive viewing or simpler interactions.
Okay, so thinking about classroom tech.
Right. For your elementary classroom, when you use educational apps or interactive whiteboards, try to prioritize activities that involve that active dragging and dropping or manipulating elements on the screen over activities that just involve tapping or viewing passively.
Make the interaction more meaningful.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It creates a stronger, more embodied connection to the material. It's like the difference between just seeing a puzzle piece and physically moving it into place yourself. That action matters.
So what does all this mean for us when we pull it all together?
Yeah, the big picture.
The common thread running through all this research seems crystal clear. Activity is absolutely central to engagement. And engagement, in turn, is absolutely central to meaningful learning.
That's the core takeaway.
An engaged user, an engaged student, isn't just passively receiving information. They're not just putting in time on task blankly. They're actively making meaning. They're building connections in their brain, testing out ideas, constructing their own understanding. This is why when we think about game-based learning, we're not just looking for something fun, though fun can help. We're looking for something that prompts and supports genuine activity, mental, physical, emotional activity from the learner.
That active, focused investment of effort.
Right. That seems to be the real engine of learning right there.
Precisely. And given this complex but really crucial understanding of engagement, this active, multifaceted thing, researchers have proposed breaking it down into distinct yet interconnected types.
Okay, types of engagement.
Yeah. Think of these as different lenses, different ways you can view and foster learning in your classroom using games. Our source material talks about the interact model and focuses on 4 key types.
4 types. What are they?
Behavioral, cognitive, affective, and sociocultural engagement.
Behavioral, cognitive, affective, sociocultural.
Okay. And it's really important to remember, as you pointed out earlier, that in reality, these very often intertwine. You rarely see just one type of engagement happening in isolation. They kind of dance together to create a rich learning experience.
Like different instruments in an orchestra, maybe.
That's a nice analogy.
Yeah.
They work together. So let's start with behavioral engagement. This is often the most outwardly observable type. It's defined simply as the focused performance of specific physical action.
Okay, the doing part, what you can see.
Exactly. In the context of games, this means the clicks, the swipes, the controller movements, the keyboard presses, whatever physical actions the player's making to interact with the game. For example, in that geometry game mentioned, Noobs v. Elites, players solve problems by clicking on specific rules, then clicking on angles, then clicking escape routes. Each of those precise clicks, that selection and execution, is behavioral engagement.
Okay, the physical interaction with the game interface.
Yes. And it also includes actions beyond just a mouse or keyboard. Think about swiping a touch screen on a tablet or performing a full-body movement if you're using a motion-sensitive interface like the old Microsoft Kinect or Sony PlayStation Move.
Right, those involve bigger movements.
Now, what makes this so powerful for you, the elementary educator, is its direct link between physical activity and learning outcomes. We saw that with the enactment effect studies. For instance, back in 2014, Homer and colleagues took a reading game for 6- and 7-year-olds and modified it. They added activities where the kids had to physically act out specific vocabulary words they encountered in the game's story.
So, like if the word was jump, they jumped.
Presumably something like that. And this wasn't just idle play. The study found it led to significantly higher gains in recognition of high-frequency words and sight words, active decoding, and total reading score compared to just playing the original game.
Wow. So acting it out boosted their reading skills.
It did. So imagine a game for your students where they don't just identify words on a screen, but they physically mimic the actions, jump, twirl, stretch, or maybe use movement to solve simple math problems, like taking steps forward for addition, steps backward for subtraction.
Yeah, physically embodying the concept.
Exactly. This research directly supports that using these kinds of physical actions, this behavioral engagement, can directly bolster academic gains. It's truly multisensory learning in action.
Okay, so how do you actually spot this behavioral engagement in your classroom if you don't have fancy tracking tools?
That's the practical question. While researchers might use high-tech tools logging click counts, tracking mouse coordinates with heat maps, analyzing user logs to see patterns of interaction for you, it often comes down to careful observation.
Just watching the kids.
Watching with a specific focus. Are their movements when using a tablet game deliberate and focused? Or are they just kind of idly tapping or swiping without apparent purpose? Those physical cues can tell a really valuable story about their level of behavioral engagement with the learning content.
Looking for purposeful action.
Right. There was even a study mentioned on Guitar Hero players. It showed that different physical movement patterns actually correlated with different underlying types of engagement. Like, were they focused purely on winning the game versus were they engaging in movements that made them feel more like a real guitar player?
Huh. Interesting. So the way they move tells a story.
It can give you clues, definitely.
Okay, so we've talked about what kids do physically, the behavioral side. But what about the incredible mental activity happening behind their eyes? That seems crucial. Let's dive into cognitive engagement. This feels like where the real deep thinking and problem solving takes root.
Absolutely. This is often seen as the heart of academic learning.
But it also sounds like it could be quite subtle to observe, maybe harder to spot than someone clicking or moving.
It can be, yes.
Yeah.
Because it's fundamentally about active mental processes. Cognitive engagement is defined as active thinking, processing information, planning, and making decisions.
It's brain work.
The brain work, exactly. Think of an online game like Physics Playground, which was mentioned in the source. In this game, players have to guide a ball to a target. How? By drawing lines on the screen that act as simple machines, levers, ramps, inclined planes.
Okay, so they're designing solutions.
Right. They have to analyze the problem, maybe predict what will happen if they draw a line here, draw it, observe the results. Maybe it doesn't work, so they adjust their approach, try again. That entire cycle analysis, prediction, experimentation, reflection, adjustment, that is pure cognitive engagement. It's their brain doing the heavy lifting.
Problem solving in action.
Precisely. And this type of engagement is deeply rooted in those cognitive theories we touched on, like Mayer's cognitive theory of multimedia learning and the idea of cognitive load.
Right, the brain having limited processing power.
Exactly. Meaningful cognitive engagement involves those three key mental processes Mayer described. Selecting the relevant information from everything presented on the screen, organizing it into some kind of coherent mental structure or model, and then integrating it, connecting it with what you already know.
Selecting, organizing, integrating.
SOI.
Okay.
Our source also highlights different types of cognitive processing involved. There's essential processing, just understanding the core material itself. There's generative processing, that deeper meaning-making, making connections, drawing inferences. And then there's extraneous processing.
What's that? The bad kind.
Often, yes.
Yeah.
Extraneous processing is mental effort spent on things that don't directly support the learning goal, like trying to figure out confusing game controls or getting distracted by irrelevant animations or sounds.
So wasted mental energy.
Exactly. And here's a crucial caution for you as an educator choosing or designing games. If the game mechanics, the things the player does, aren't well aligned with the actual learning outcomes you want, they can accidentally increase that extraneous cognitive load. And that can actually decrease learning, even if the game seems engaging on the surface.
So complexity for complexity's sake is bad.
It can be. You want the mental effort focused squarely on the learning, not just on navigating a confusing or overly busy game interface.
Okay, so how do games foster good cognitive engagement?
Well, interestingly, other forms of engagement, behavioral, affective, even sociocultural, can be strategically leveraged to lead into cognitive engagement. But really well-designed learning mechanics are paramount.
Learning mechanics, like how the game asks you to solve problems.
Exactly. For instance, back to the geometry game Noobs v. Leets, the researchers compared two different mechanics for solving angle problems. One version just had students type in the numerical value for the missing angle. Quick and easy.
Right, get the answer.
The other version, while maybe perceived as less interesting or more work by the students, required them to explicitly specify which angle measurement was given, which angle was missing, and which geometry rule they applied to find the solution.
Ah, making them show their work, essentially.
Precisely. And guess what? That second mechanic, the one requiring more explicit articulation of the thinking process, led to significantly higher learning gains.
Wow. Okay.
So for you, the elementary educator, this is huge. It means when you're designing or choosing games, look for ones where students don't just get the answer. Look for games that require them to show or articulate their thinking process.
How could that look in an elementary math game?
Well, instead of just typing 8 for 5 plus 3, maybe they have to drag and drop the number sentence 5 plus 3 onto the answer box. Or maybe they have to choose the correct strategy icon before solving. It forces them to select, organize, and integrate that knowledge more deeply.
Making the thinking visible. I like that.
Another point from the source. When it comes to rewards in games, intrinsic rewards seem much better for fostering cognitive engagement than purely extrinsic ones.
Intrinsic versus extrinsic. What's the difference again?
Intrinsic rewards are valuable within the game's learning context, like maybe solving a puzzle gives you a new tool or ability that helps you solve harder puzzles. Or maybe completing a level unlocks the next section of the topic within the game. The reward is directly related to progressing in the learning or the gameplay.
Okay, unlocks more learning or deeper play.
Right. Extrinsic rewards are things like points, stars, badges, stickers, things that are kind of external to the core activity itself. They can be motivating, sure, but they might not drive that deep cognitive engagement as effectively as a reward that fuels further learning exploration.
So a virtual key to the next chapter is better than just getting a gold star sticker.
For fostering deep cognitive engagement, the research suggests yes. The key is more integrated with the learning process itself. Also, things like using visual cues effectively within a game, highlighting important elements, showing relationships, prompting students to connect different pieces of information, that can also lead to improved learning and cognitive engagement.
Okay, smart design choices matter a lot. So how do we measure this then, if it's happening inside their heads?
It's trickier than measuring clicks, for sure. Researchers use a whole toolkit. They might look at the number of problems attempted or solutions generated. They analyze time spent on specific tasks within the game. Log files can sometimes reveal patterns of metacognition moments where a student might pause, backtrack, or try different strategies, indicating they're thinking about their own thinking.
Or maybe reveal they're just gaming the system, trying to find shortcuts.
That too. Log files can sometimes show unproductive patterns. Researchers also use surveys asking students about the mental effort they felt they exerted. Eye tracking technology is fascinating. It shows exactly where a student's gaze is focused on the screen, revealing their attention patterns.
Wow.
And of course, there are neuroscience measures like EEG, looking at brainwave activity, although that's usually confined to lab settings.
Right, not practical for Tuesday morning math class.
Not yet, anyway. But for you in the classroom, observing for cognitive engagement might involve looking for less obvious cues. And here's a really interesting, maybe counterintuitive insight from one study mentioned.
Okay.
It found that sometimes higher learning outcomes were correlated with lower amounts of classroom conversation during the game activity.
Less talking meant more learning. How?
The interpretation was that the students were so deeply engrossed, they were enjoying space to think. They were internally processing, planning, problem solving.
Ah, so quiet focus can be a really good sign.
Absolutely. For you, this means recognizing that not all cognitive engagement looks active from the outside. Sometimes that quiet, focused contemplation is exactly what's needed for deep thinking. So make sure to allow moments for independent thought and processing during game-based activities. It's not always about audible chatter. Sometimes the most important work is happening silently.
That's a great point about quiet thinking being productive.
Yeah.
But what about the other end of the spectrum? The big, visible emotions we see when kids play games, the excitement, the frustration, the joy. How does that whole dimension tie into learning? Let's explore effective engagement.
Yes, the emotional dimension. This is where the magic, or sometimes the challenge of emotional connection, comes into play. Effective engagement involves the emotional responses that happen within the gameplay experience, and it often draws on players' pre-existing attitudes and beliefs.
So how they feel while playing.
Exactly. Consider that game mentioned, All You Can ET, where players serve food and drinks to different alien customers. The key here was that the appearance of these aliens was deliberately designed by the researchers to evoke specific levels of emotional arousal in the players.
They made some aliens look, scarier or cuter?
Something like that, designed to trigger different emotional responses. And the research found that higher levels of physiological arousal actually correlated with higher gains in the cognitive skills the game was designed to train, like executive functions.
Whoa. So feeling more emotion, even if it was maybe stress or excitement from a weird alien, helped them learn the cognitive skill better.
In that study, yes. The player's emotional response to the game elements, in this case, the alien characters, was a prime example of effective engagement. It shows how games can tap into our feelings, potentially to drive or enhance learning.
Interesting. So why foster effective engagement? What are the purposes?
Well, it serves multiple purposes, potentially. First, especially for games that have really high cognitive demands, ones that are mentally tiring, adding positive emotional engagement can lead to longer playtimes. It helps counteract that fatigue from intense mental effort, makes it more sustainable.
Keeps them going.
Right. Second, there's a suggestion it might actually increase the training effect, maybe through the involvement of the limbic system in the brain, which is heavily tied to both emotion and memory formation. Stronger emotion, potentially stronger memory trace.
Okay.
And beyond just boosting cognitive skills, some games prioritize purely affective goals. They want to change how you feel or think about something. Games like Peacemaker, about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or Darfur is Dying, about the humanitarian crisis, are designed specifically to promote empathy and change players' attitudes about complex social issues.
Right, games for change.
Exactly. Now, those specific examples might be for older students, but the principle is incredibly powerful for elementary education, too. Imagine a game specifically designed to help your young students understand and empathize with characters from diverse backgrounds, or characters facing difficult situations like bullying, or maybe understanding different family structures. That fosters crucial social-emotional learning.
Yeah, building empathy through simulated experience, that's powerful.
It really can be. And many different game design features can be used to foster this effective engagement. This all falls under the umbrella of emotional design.
Emotional design, okay.
This means the deliberate use of game design elements, things like the aesthetic design, the art style, the colors, the incentive system, the personalities of game characters, the narrative or story, the sound effects, the musical score, all used intentionally to induce specific emotions in the player, with the ultimate goal of enhancing their learning or changing their perspective.
Using art and sound to create a mood or feeling.
Precisely. Even feedback systems can have an effective component. Research on intelligent tutoring systems found that sometimes feedback designed to correct errors could induce feelings of frustration or confusion in learners.
What sounds bad?
You'd think so. But the researchers found that when properly scaffolded and managed, this productive struggle, this temporary confusion or frustration, could actually support deeper cognitive engagement and ultimately lead to better learning. The emotion triggered more effort.
Huh. So not all negative emotions are bad in learning.
Not necessarily, no. A little bit of productive struggle, feeling momentarily stuck or frustrated, but then overcoming it with the right support, can be a sign of deep engagement. It can lead to those aha moments and significant learning breakthroughs. The key is managing it so it doesn't just become overwhelming discouragement.
Finding that sweet spot of challenge again.
Exactly. So how do we actually spot this emotional engagement in the classroom if we're not wiring kids up to machines?
Yeah, the practical view.
Well, while researchers might use things like self-report questionnaires about emotions, analyze user logs for patterns associated with frustration, like repeated errors, use gaze tracking, or even physiological markers like skin conductance, heart rate, respiration, EEG, fMRI.
Wow, the high-tech stuff.
Right, but for you in the classroom, it's often about paying close attention to the visible cues. Is a child's face lit up with genuine excitement when they solve a tricky problem? Are they leaning forward, maybe gritting their teeth in that productive frustration, still persisting despite a challenge?
Or maybe looking worried for a character.
Or maybe their eyes well up a little when a character in the game faces a sad situation. Those visible emotional cues, facial expressions, body language, maybe even verbal exclamations, those are your signals. Observing these emotional responses can give you valuable insight into their effective engagement and might inform how you support them or discuss the game's themes afterward.
Okay, that's fascinating how feelings tie in. So we have what kids do with their bodies, behavioral, what they do with their minds, cognitive, and how their emotions play a role, affective. But humans are also inherently social creatures, right? We learn with and from each other. How does that translate into game-based learning? Let's turn our attention now to sociocultural engagement.
That's a great transition because sociocultural engagement really taps into that profound idea that social interactions are often essential to learning. It highlights the basic human need for relatedness, for connection with others. That's actually a key component in self-determination theory, which helps explain why people are intrinsically motivated to play games and connect with others within them or around them.
So learning is a social activity.
Exactly. It's about learning within a social and a cultural context. The interactions matter and the cultural backdrop matters.
Can you give an example?
Sure. A classic example is a complex strategy game like Civilization III. While you can play it alone, a lot of the deep learning and engagement happens around the game. Learners collaborate, maybe in person or online. They set shared goals, they debate strategies, they assign roles within their team, they share insights and discoveries in online forums or fan communities.
So the community around the game is part of the engagement.
Absolutely. That collaboration, that shared sense-making is a powerful form of sociocultural engagement. It's learning together.
Okay. What about culture within a game?
Another powerful example mentioned is the game Never Alone, Kissima Ingechuna. This is a puzzle platform game, but it's based directly on a traditional Inupiaq story, an Alaska Native tale. It was developed in collaboration with the Inupiaq community. Players can cooperate, playing as a young girl and an Arctic fox, to overcome challenges drawn from the story and the environment. And as they play, they unlock these beautiful video vignettes featuring elders and storytellers sharing insights about their culture, their beliefs, their history. So players are not just solving puzzles, they are learning about and hopefully coming to value the Inupiaq culture through the gameplay itself.
Wow, that's using a game as a cultural gateway.
Exactly. And for you, the elementary educator, this is incredibly powerful. Think about the possibilities. You could use games as a way into cultural understanding for your students. Imagine having them play games from different cultures around the world, or games like Never Alone that tell stories rooted in specific traditions.
Broadening their horizons through play.
Yes, and encouraging collaborative play in almost any game context is a fantastic way to build teamwork, communication skills, perspective taking. It makes learning a shared social experience which taps right into that sociocultural engagement. It's about fostering empathy, collaboration, and maybe even global awareness, all through play.
Okay, so how is this fostered? Through game design or things outside the game?
Both, really. Sociocultural engagement can be fostered through specific game design features built into the game, things like integrated chat functions, multiplayer modes where kids play together or against each other, role-playing mechanics that encourage taking on different perspectives, or even incentive systems that explicitly reward collaboration or helping others.
Like getting bonus points for teamwork.
Could be. But just as important is the emergent culture around games, those affinity groups, the fandoms, the forums, the YouTube walkthroughs where people share tips, that all plays a huge role in sociocultural engagement, often happening completely outside the formal game structure.
The whole ecosystem.
Exactly. And research also highlights the importance of the context where the game is played. One study looked at children interacting with games in museum environments. It found that having appropriate levels of guidance and facilitation from adults actually supported more productive social engagement among the kids.
So the teacher's role is still important in group gameplay.
Very much so. When you implement group-based learning games in your classroom, remember that facilitation piece. Provide clear instructions, maybe structure the collaboration a bit, facilitate discussions afterwards. Don't just throw them into a group with a game and hope for the best. Guide their collaborative journey to make sure it's productive and fosters meaningful social and cognitive interaction.
Good advice. So how do researchers measure this, all the social stuff?
It involves a pretty broad range of methods. They might use surveys asking about collaboration or feelings of relatedness. Social network analysis can map out who is interacting with whom. Interviews allow deep dives into students' experiences of collaborating. And detailed discourse analysis, carefully examining the transcripts of conversations students have while playing or discussing the game, can reveal a lot about their shared understanding and problem-solving processes.
Looking at the actual talk?
Yes, and for you in the classroom, it's often about observing those group dynamics. Are they sharing ideas? Are they listening to each other? How are they resolving disagreements? Listening to their conversations, noting how they help each other navigate challenges. Those are your windows into their sociocultural engagement.
Wow. Okay, so that's behavioral, cognitive, affective, and sociocultural engagement.
Yeah.
When you lay them all out like that, it becomes really clear that you can't just draw hard lines between them, can you?
Not usually, no. They're very often tightly interconnected.
Like threads in a rich tapestry, maybe, all working together. A single observation, like just seeing how much time spent a student puts into a game, that might reflect behavioral engagement because they're physically clicking and playing.
Right.
But also cognitive engagement if they're deeply involved in solving the problems. And maybe even affective engagements if they're really enjoying the challenge or connecting with the story. All happening at once.
Exactly. That time spent measure alone doesn't tell you which type of engagement is dominant or how they're interacting. This more nuanced understanding, breaking it down into these 4 facets, has some really important implications, both theoretically for researchers and practically for educators like you.
Okay, let's talk implications. What does this mean for the field?
Well, on the theoretical side, having this more fine-grained framework allows for a more nuanced discourse about engagement. Researchers can look back at previous studies and reassess the findings. Maybe studies that used very different measures of engagement, like one asking if students forgot about the passage of time versus another that recorded working actively on a particular task. Maybe those studies weren't really measuring the same thing, and comparing them directly was problematic.
Comparing apples and oranges.
Kind of, yeah. This clearer framework helps us be more precise. It also allows us to potentially include investigations that weren't originally framed as engagement studies at all, but actually tapped into behavioral actions or cognitive strategies or emotional responses in a learning context. It gives us a much richer, more complete picture by connecting more research dots.
Okay, makes the research clearer. What about the practical side? For teachers?
This is where it directly impacts you as an educator. This clear conceptual separation of the different types of engagement provides, I think, much needed guidance for practitioners, for game designers making educational games, and for games researchers studying them.
How does it guide me?
It empowers you to look at a game and think more specifically. You can start to refer to specific game features designed to elicit a specific type of engagement. You can ask, is this clicking mechanic mainly for behavioral practice? Does this puzzle require deep cognitive planning? Does this story aim for effective empathy? Does this multiplayer mode foster sociocultural collaboration?
So analyzing the game through these 4 lenses.
Exactly, and then you can connect that to why you're using the game. How will this specific type of engagement contribute to the intended learning outcomes? Whether that's an immediate skill practice, proximal outcome, or a longer-term change in understanding or attitude, distal outcome.
Making more informed choices.
Precisely. It means you can make much more informed choices about which games to use in your elementary classroom, and more importantly, articulate why you're using them for particular learning goals. You'll be able to explain not just that a game is engaging, but how it engages behaviorally, cognitively, effectively, socioculturally, and what specific learning that particular form of engagement is designed to foster.
It's like having a much more precise toolkit for understanding and choosing learning games. Not just, is it fun, but how does it engage? And for what learning purpose?
That's it, exactly. A more analytical toolkit.
Okay, this is incredibly helpful. But you mentioned this is an ongoing area of research. So this deep dive is really just the beginning, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. The research community is still actively exploring many facets of engagement, constantly refining our understanding.
And these future directions, these open questions, they probably hold incredible promise for teaching practice, right? Offering even more precise ways to harness the power of games for learning down the line. It's kind of exciting to think about what's next.
Indeed, there are several key areas for future investigation highlighted in the source. One crucial area is to delve deeper into the antecedents of engagement.
Antecedents. What comes before engagement?
Exactly. Understanding what learner variables, things like their individual motivation levels coming in, their prior knowledge of the subject, maybe even personality traits. How do these factors predict or lead to different types or levels of engagement in a game?
So why one kid gets hooked and another doesn't, even with the same game?
Right. For you, the takeaway is recognizing that every child in your classroom is unique. Understanding their individual differences, their starting points, their interests, their confidence will be absolutely key to unlocking the right kind of engagement for each of them in game-based learning. It reinforces that it's not a one-size-fits-all solution.
Personalization matters. What else?
Another critical area is to identify and systematically validate specific game design features. We need more rigorous research to figure out precisely which features, which mechanics, which visual styles, what feedback types, which social structures consistently and reliably foster specific types of engagement: behavioral, cognitive, affective, sociocultural.
Nailing down what works for each type of engagement.
Yes. Your takeaway here is that as this research progresses, it will hopefully lead to much better evidence-based guidance for you when selecting games, or even perhaps when helping co-design simple learning games or activities. Imagine a future where you can look up a database and find games scientifically validated to promote exactly the kind of critical thinking or collaboration or empathy that you want to cultivate for a specific lesson.
That would be amazing. Like consumer reports for educational games based on engagement types.
Wouldn't that be great? Researchers also need to continue refining the measures of engagement themselves. We need measures that are valid, measuring what they claim to measure,
Right.
reliable, consistent, and ideally can operate in real time during gameplay.
Real-time measurement.
Yeah, games offer these incredible, untapped opportunities for collecting detailed process data. Every single click, every move, every decision, every time interval can potentially be logged. If we can cleverly analyze this digital breadcrumb trail, maybe coupled with some non-invasive physiological measures someday, maybe simple eye tracking integrated into tablets, or analyzing subtle changes in interaction patterns. The goal would be to get real-time insights into how students are truly engaging moment by moment.
Wow. So for me in the classroom,
Imagine future tools. Maybe a teacher dashboard that gives you immediate objective feedback, visualized simply, showing how different students in your class are engaging with a learning game right now. Are they stuck? Are they deeply processing? Are they getting frustrated? This could allow you to adapt your instruction or provide targeted support right on the fly.
that could be a total game changer for personalized learning.
It really could. We also need to investigate the patterns of engagement and their effect on learning. How does one type of engagement maybe lead to or enable another type? And how do different combinations or sequences of engagement connect to specific learning outcomes?
Like, does behavioral practice lead to cognitive understanding?
Exactly. For instance, in that Noobs v. Leets math game, maybe the initial behavioral engagement, just learning to click the right spots, is necessary first. But then, does that reliably lead to cognitive outcomes, like better geometry problem solving? Or does it maybe also lead to affective outcomes, like students developing more positive attitudes toward math because they feel successful? Or maybe it leads to sociocultural outcomes if they start collaborating on harder problems.
How do different types build on each other?
Right. The takeaway for you is that learning isn't just about those cognitive test scores. Games can powerfully target behavioral skills, affective changes like confidence or empathy, and sociocultural competencies like collaboration. And these different outcomes often build on and reinforce each other, creating a truly holistic learning experience. It's about the whole child.
Okay, one last area.
Finally, and this is really crucial, we need to better understand the conditions under which engagement is most beneficial. Because as we touched on with cognitive load, more engagement isn't always better.
Right, the extraneous load problem.
Yeah. Exactly. If game elements that are designed purely to foster engagement, maybe flashy animations, complex narratives unrelated to the learning goal, overly demanding social interactions if they require learners to process excessive non-essential information, it can lead to cognitive overload and actually hurt learning, even if the student seems engaged on the surface.
So engagement needs to be purposeful.
Yes. For you, this means being discerning when choosing games. Ensure the game's design supports focused learning, not just distraction or overwhelming stimulation. It really is about the quality and the type of engagement, making sure it aligns with your learning goals, not just maximizing the quantity of time spent or the level of excitement.
Okay, wow. This has been incredibly insightful. So let's try to synthesize. What does this all mean for you, our listener, thinking about your journey as an educator? Today, we didn't just throw around the word engagement. We really broke it down into its core components: behavioral, cognitive, affective, and sociocultural.
The four facets.
And we've seen that engagement, defined as that active, focused investment of effort, isn't just nice to have. It seems absolutely crucial for building real knowledge and deep understanding in young minds. It's fundamentally about empowering students to do, to think, to feel, and to connect as they learn.
That's a great summary. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, learning isn't just some purely cognitive process happening in isolation inside a child's head. As the research shows, it arises from their physical actions, from their emotions, and profoundly from how they interact socially and culturally with others, and with the learning material itself.
The whole learner.
The whole learner. And this means that as you step into the classroom, or as you think about how to support learning in any context, games offer this incredibly rich, full spectrum of ways to engage learners on all these multiple levels simultaneously.
Which leads to a final thought, maybe.
It raises, I think, an important and exciting question for you to ponder as you move forward. How can you, as an elementary educator, intentionally design or select game-based learning experiences that deliberately tap into these different forms of engagement, behavioral, cognitive, affective, and sociocultural, to create truly profound, effective, and memorable learning journeys for your students?
Not just picking a game because it looks fun, but thinking strategically about how it engages.
Exactly. Think about what meaningful engagement looks like for each child in your diverse classroom. And how can you use the power of games to support every facet of their learning and development? It's an exciting challenge, and it's one that well-designed games are uniquely positioned to help you meet.